Well, there are, with all the guests attending the Queen's funeral last night, you'd be forgiven for being unable to name one or two of the attendees. I could pick most of them, but anyway, as the new Prime Minister of the UK, Liz Truss, walked towards Westminster Abbey, we had this commentary from Tracy, Grimshaw and Peter Overton.
No, hard to identify. Maybe minor royals, members of the... I can't identify them at this point.
We can't spot everyone, unfortunately. They look like they could well be local dignitaries. It's hard to see. We're looking at the backs of their heads most.
But I think we are now getting to the pointy end, as they say, of the... I'm just told that was Liz Truss, the new Prime Minister, in the distance that we could see hopping out of that car. Well, thank you very much.
So, Rebecca, Liz Truss wants to be Margaret Thatcher, but, were you surprised that Australia's so-called top media people were unable to recognise the new British Prime Minister? She has been a little bit in the news recently.
You'd think so. I mean, she was shaking hands with the Queen, so even those who only focused on royal news should have caught a glimpse of her at Balmoral. But, the English seem to think this reflected on Liz Truss. I also thought it reflected somewhat on Tracy, Grimshaw and Peter Overton, who maybe need to sort of brush up a little bit on current affairs as well as royal watching. But
are we being
what
unfair?
Can you do? Even the Queen...
Sorry, James.
Well,
Rowan, the Queen is gone but not forgotten. Liz Truss is forgotten but not gone. But you can't be too hard, I don't think, on Tracy Grimshaw, because I was watching the BBC, and when the Prime Minister of New Zealand walked in, she was acknowledged. When Justin Trudeau walked in, he was acknowledged. But when Anthony Albanese walked in, there was dead silence. But it was worse than that on the BBC. The BBC commentary team mistook the Queen of Denmark and her son, Crown Prince Frederik, for the King and Queen of the Netherlands. So not only did they get the country wrong, but they mistook mother and son for husband and wife.
Oh, Alexandra, it was amazing. You are a young ambassador for the constitutional monarchy that we are blessed with. How did you enjoy enjoy is probably the wrong word. What did you make of the funeral last night?
Well, speaking of commentators making mistakes, I think the best time is when there was no commentary at all and they just turned it off and let the funeral play as it was intended. And I think the best part was actually when they were coming up to Windsor Castle toward the end, and you had the procession get closer and all the cars had the flowers thrown on them, and they had all the horses there, and they came up the flower promenade at the end with a big castle in the background, and that was the real tearjerker at the end.
Tearjerker? OK, Rebecca, were you in tears watching the funeral last night?
Well, what I really found in a way moving was to see all of these heads of states, all of these politicians, prime ministers, sitting in a house of God where they had to recognise that they are held and will be judged by a higher authority. And I found that moving, and it gave me some hope. We've talked about getting rid of the Lord's Prayer in the Parliament here. I think it's very important for mere mortals to realise that all of us are held to a higher standard.
James, I think Rebecca hit on the critical part of that service. It was the bringing together in an ancient kind of ceremony of the church, of religion, in fact. There are references to the Hebrew Torah. There was Christianity, obviously. The Queen is the representative of the church. There was the military there. There was the state. There were the world leaders. As Rebecca says, there was this sense that this was the higher authority, not quite divine right of kings, but certainly suggesting some kind of connection through... what did you make of it?
There were two things in the funeral that I thought were quite amazing. The first one was that the first hymn that was sung talked about when all proud empires fade away, acknowledging that God's reign was the only one that would be eternal. And I think it's amazing when you've got politicians who acknowledge they are not the centre of the universe. That's a good thing for all of us. And then right at the end of the funeral, there's a rod of authority which is broken in half to symbolise that Queen Elizabeth's reign is now over and she enters into eternity not as a royal but as just a normal human being like any of us, and we all have to account for our lives. I thought that was very powerful.
Alexandra, what did you take out of the symbolism, the tradition?
Well, I was going to add, there was an interesting piece of commentary happening online. That was a whole stack of Republicans who had no love for the Queen, found themselves crying or attending these events, overcome with a sense of emotion and a connection. They couldn't quite articulate what it was that they were feeling. And it shows that even if you're not religious, even if you're not a monarchist, there's something about this cultural movement with the monarchy and all the military that harks back to history that we all share. And it was getting under the skin of all these people, remembering what this stood for and what their history really meant, and how important it was not to lose it in this new age that's coming up.
Rebecca, I found it fascinating that Meghan Markle was sitting there. She's basically accused a member of the royal family, we never quite found out who, of being racist, and the implication being that they're all these racist royal family. But if you looked into the audience there, partly because of the Commonwealth, obviously, but there was any number of sheikhs from the Middle East, there was leaders from every corner of the world, Africa, the Caribbean and so on. It was the original diversity and inclusion crowd. It was almost like the HR mob from the palace had gone through and gone, right, let's get some diversity in here. But it was extraordinary. Rebecca.
Yes, it really, well, the Commonwealth is just a magnificent testimony to the achievement of Elizabeth, and all of these people who protest her reign and colonisation seem to have missed the fundamental point, is that she presided over the peaceful decolonisation of all of these countries around the world, and mostly transitioning to democracies and to countries that recognise freedom of speech and the rights of the individual, and all of these wonderful blessings that flow from Magna Carta, from these British traditions. So really the kind of howling and complaints that we've heard from those who oppose the monarchy fail to see these extraordinary achievements precisely because they're totally ahistorical. They know no history, so they understand none of these benefits, and they think it's okay to just make things up. Well, unfortunately it isn't, but you can see the great fruits of this whole long, slow process of liberty and of ever expanded liberty. So I think, like Alexandra, I think it's enormously important that we hold on to this and preserve it going into the future, because there are enormous threats to it coming.
Absolutely. Well, Sky's coverage was brilliant of the event. So there was moments of humour. James, you're always one with a cheap pun, one of your trading in stock in trades. I love this exchange that Meghan Markle, apparently you're not supposed to have bare arms at a funeral, but someone tweeted, this isn't good, bare arms at a funeral, that's not correct, to which some wag replied, well, she's American, she has the right to bear arms. Did that make you smile, James?
That is a pun even I would be proud of, Rowan. Very good, well played.
I thought that was good. What did you make of Meghan's? We've got to talk about Meghan. I mean, come on, she was there, so we'd talk about it. Why else would she turn up?
Well, it's clear that neither of you are women, because that discussion about the bare arms was they thought that she was pregnant. And that was they thought her choice of outfit was because of this, you see. And so that was what was going around underneath that little pun all of last night. But I just want to add to Rebecca's point about Elizabeth. While we're giving peace prizes to warmongers, she was the great peacekeeper of the world, and she solved so many problems with a dance or a smile or a meeting. And while we've got NATO and the United Nations and the European Union all trying to use bureaucracy to solve the problem of peace, it was actually the Queen who brought peace to so many nations in the Commonwealth, and that is something worth remembering.
Absolutely.